I really miss being able to cover the Neptunia games. Idea Factory International brought over a bunch of Nep games for the PlayStation Vita, but until this week the Switch has only gotten one. Though considering how much trouble Compile Hearts had with optimizing Switch games, it might be better that they waited. What many people consider to be the peak of the Neptunia franchise in an RPG I've been waiting years to play on a handheld. Here is my review of Megadimension Neptunia V2 for the Nintendo Switch. In terms of story and timeline placement, this is a direct sequel to Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory that released for PS3, otherwise known as Rebirth 3 on PlayStation Vita and PC. The story is about Neptune and Nepgear being sucked into another dimension and becoming involved not only in the threats that dimension's CPU is facing, but also forces that threaten their own dimension. This plot point really starts to expand on a concept introduced in Victory, but takes it to a much bigger scale, along with giving us a lot more explanation and backstory behind it. Putting that point aside, this is a Neptunia game through and through, so you should expect a lot of comedy and a lot of parodies. Now, if you're not familiar with the series, Neptunia has always been about making fun of the game industry and designing characters that are references to consoles and developers. For example, all of the main characters or CPUs of the show are based off of game consoles, and many of the side characters are parodies of game companies, including Compile Heart and Idea Factory, the franchise's developers. And this is what gives Neptunia a really nice charm. It's filled with comedy and jokes, and every main character you see is based off of some part of the gaming industry. Though I will admit that you've gotta like a story-heavy game to really get into the plot of Neptunia. For as lengthy as these RPGs are, a very large chunk of that time will be story scenes, and more story scenes. I personally love this aspect because I really enjoy the jokes and parodies they make. It's just worth noting that it is very text heavy, so if you're not big on story, you'll probably be using the skip feature quite a lot. When it comes to gameplay, this is what I like to call a Compile Heart RPG. It's a bit of a cross between turn-based and action RPGs, and it's a system that both the Neptunia and Fairy Fencer F series have used. But before we get into that, let's clarify a couple things. The Nintendo Switch version of V2 is based off of the vanilla PS4 and PC version, meaning that it doesn't have any of the extra features that were added to the PlayStation VR version Neptunia V2R. DLC is also something we need to talk about. All of the DLC for PS4 and PC are available for the Switch, but they're having it all be separate eShop purchases instead of being built in. And honestly, that's a bit of a downer. Even outside of the price being $30, a lot of these recent Switch, PS3, and PS4 ports have generally just had a rule of thumb of building all of that stuff in. But let me get off my tangent and get back into the game itself. Megadimension Neptunia V2 is a little different than the previous games of the series, as it is set in 3 different arcs that kind of feel like games in and of themselves. They even have their own splash screens where you can start new games there. Now when you start each of these, you have a lot of story content and you move around on 2D world maps like you did in the previous games. The main difference is you don't have a cursor this time to just hover over the next dungeon you need to go to. You actually use a facility to create a new route and move along said dotted line route, getting into random encounters on your way there. And outside of that, you have a lot of other facilities in towns as well. These facilities are used for buying and developing items, doing missions, sending NPCs to dungeons to find new materials for you, and investing in countries to unlock new things for you to buy and develop. Now when we actually start diving into the dungeons, a lot of things will feel very familiar, and thankfully, the Nintendo Switch has only gotten one 3D Neptunia game, so you won't have reused assets syndrome. To briefly explain, Compile Heart remade the first 3 Neptunia games on PlayStation Vita and PC in the form of the Rebirth games. This was basically just them remaking all 3 games with Victory's engines and assets, so a lot of dungeons and enemy types were exactly the same between all 3 games. The only differences were the story scenes, what characters were available, and the enemy models specific to that game's boss fights. While V2 does have a bunch of new enemies and dungeons, there are still quite a few that I remember from Rebirth 3. But considering the time since those games originally came out, and this being the Switch's first 3D Neptunia game, you probably won't even have to worry about it. And now let's get into the combat system, which I mentioned earlier was a cross between turn-based and action gameplay. Combat is turn-based, but when a character's turn comes up, they have a limited amount of space they can freely move around to set up their attacks. You've also got the combo and range system that varies from weapon to weapon. You've got 3 different classes of attacks that characters can learn as they level up, and depending on what weapon you have, you can put in so many of each type. Every weapon also has a different range box for normal attacks, so as you go throughout the game and do your upgrades, you'll go from being able to attack one enemy at a time to potentially an entire group. Adding in you doing different damage to enemies from different angles, along with the EXE gauge for transformations and special attacks, the combat system has a lot to it. Now let's talk about how all of this comes together to make a very beefy RPG. On top of being a 20 to 30 hour venture to get to your first ending, it also has an ending system where the first 2 endings are very easy to get and the true ending takes a lot of different conditions from across the entire game. Thankfully, it's got an amazing New Game Plus feature where you can bring over pretty much everything from items and levels to the entire character roster. Instead of having to recruit every character at certain points of the story like your first playthrough, you got access to literally everyone you had at the end of the game at the very start. Now let's dive into presentation, which has been criticized for its Japanese version, but we know a little bit more now. Visually, it looks really nice. There are a few jaggies in handheld mode, but overall the models look really refined and smooth. And when it comes to frame rate, the game does have frame drops, but it really depends on what your settings have. Like the PC version, when you jump into configuration, there are a bunch of graphical, shadow, and effect animations that you can turn off and get better performance out of. For example, here's me roaming around the initial dungeon with all of those turned on and I'm getting a lot of frame drops. But as soon as I go into configuration and turn them off, it gets very smooth and really nice. We do still get frame drops in a couple dungeons that I also had issues with on PC and in some of the victory animations, but it does stay nice and smooth for probably 70 to 80% of the game. And that's all I've got to say about performance, so let's dive right into battery life. On the original model, V2 has a battery range of 2 hours and 48 minutes up to 3 hours and 12 minutes. On the Nintendo Switch Lite, it has a range of 3 hours and 21 minutes up to 4 hours and 54 minutes. And on the V2 or Redbox 2019 model, it has a range of 4 hours and 41 minutes up to 6 hours and 17 minutes. In conclusion, Megadimension Neptunia V2 brings what many view as the peak of the series to handhelds for the first time. Now on the downside, the DLC is separate rather than built in, the game's story can drag on during some scenes, and it's got some issues with FPS drops. Though with the latter having a lot of it being fixed by disabling graphics options and settings, it makes this a great parody RPG for handheld Nep fans to enjoy. Reviews to Go rates Megadimension Neptunia V2 for the Nintendo Switch a 7.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.